Thanks a lot. First of all, thanks a lot for coming in and making the presentations and for all of the campaigning work that you've been doing on this issue. Probably barely a week goes by where I don't get letters from constituents about this. And to me, it seems that the phrase, nothing about us without us, that sums up this issue, whereby we are, someone made the point earlier, I think it was Tony, we're dealing with deferred wages here. That's what occupational pensions are. And the reality as it is at the moment is that your deferred wages and the deferred wages of the hundreds of thousands of retired workers who you represent can be changed without any input whatsoever by you. And I think the ask that you have is, it's not a very substantial ask, it's quite minimal given the situation that you're in. It would have no impact, as the point has been made, in any other aspect of industrial relations. It's purely related to the situation where we're dealing with changes to pension schemes. It has no impact in terms of any ability to engage in strike action. It doesn't give you the right to engage in strike action, anything like that. So it is purely about being at the table at the WRC. The IBEC submission and the Minister's position certainly seems to be that employers that have occupational pension schemes have effectively no obligations to retired workers, and there's no need for you to be, or no right for you to be involved in any discussions around that. If you could spell out, maybe in relation to the ESB, what the impact of that is, what that has meant for you in terms of, for retired workers, how you've been able to be treated as a consequence of being completely excluded from the process.
Just to give the practical example that I have made in my statement about the agreement that was made back in 2010, where retired workers were not at the table. There were two parties to that agreement, the trade unions and the employers, and they negotiated an agreement that affected retired workers. You should not have a situation where the employer and the trade unions come together to affect the pensions of people who are already retired. And certainly the retired workers didn't have a seat at the table. So if they are going to do something to affect the incomes of retired workers, you should be at the table. And to this very day, we are actually still seeing the effects of that. And this is 13 years later. Yeah. And the problem is that agreement is in place and it is still being used. And we have no right to be there to try and negotiate it, renegotiate it, or to actually overturn it, but there's no end date on it. I've never seen a situation where you have an agreement. I'm sure people are familiar with industrial relations. You have an agreement that starts on a particular date and you probably end it. This agreement has absolutely no end date. So that is a practical example of how we're still being affected. Yeah. And there have been other issues in the past year where the governance of the scheme and the rules of the scheme, they apply to all members. Yeah. But they've had consultation process and negotiations with the employee members of the scheme on those issues, and two rule changes during the past year, and the retired workers were not involved and they were not included in that process, nor were nobody spoke to them. It sort of went through, it just went through seamlessly, and we had no involvement at all in the process. Yeah. So that is the effect that it.
Just one other point about that. I mean, the suggestion was kind of made earlier, and I think in this debate it often is, that really this is about underfunding of pension schemes. And it seems to me that's a conflation of two issues. Sometimes there may be an overlap of those two issues. But I understand this can arise in a situation where there is no question of underfunding of pension schemes whatsoever. Deputy Smith gave me her own experience as a shop steward in an instance where that happened. Or indeed underfunding can be provoked by changes that the employer proposed to make in terms of reducing their own contributions, creating a crisis then to justify. So could you maybe just expand a little bit about that?
Well, John clearly pointed out, my colleague John pointed out that, I mean, John has had vast experience on the whole industrial relations process in his time in the ESB, that if there was an underfunding situation, there have been, and I personally, during my working life, had to pay additional contributions to the scheme where there was an underfunding situation, just so the scheme could recover. Now that was reversed once that underfunding issue was dealt with. So, underfunding is an issue that can be dealt with by the existing workers. You know, there's never been a situation in terms of ESB where you have an industrial relations and agreement that has affected retired workers. That agreement in 2010 was the first time that the incomes of retired workers were affected by an industrial relations agreement on pensions.
Yeah.
Before that, it was dealt with the employer making additional contributions to the scheme, or the employees on a temporary, maybe for a period of time, would make additional contributions, and then that's how the underfunding was dealt with. And I just sort of reiterate what I said earlier: there is no underfunding issue currently in the ESB scheme. There may be in other schemes, but there's certainly none in the ESB at the moment.
Thanks a lot. One question. I presume you have seen the submissions by other organisations in relation to this issue, for example, from IBEC and so on. Do you have opinions on those?
I certainly do. It's in my written submission. First of all, I was glad to see the support that the bill has gotten from all the contributors to the public consultation. And I was certainly heartened to see that the ICTU have given support to the retired workers on this particular issue. And it increases, I think, the substantial support that there is there now for this bill, not only from the retired workers, but by SIP2 supporting it, it's also on behalf of the active members of the scheme, because there is a fairness to be sorted out here. With regard to the IBEC submission, I think it's the only submission to the public consultation process that is negative. And I just want to refer you, if I may, Chairman, to one particular sentence in it, which I think sums up the IBEC position. It says, once an employee retires or leaves the employment, the employer no longer budgets for persons external to the business, nor should they have to, nor do these employers take part in any further benefit negotiations, as they have no consideration to offer. Now, how appalling is that from any organisation which is essentially saying to retired workers, once you go out that door, you have no more rights whatsoever. You have no relation to the sponsoring employer. It's absolutely appalling.
Thank you, Mr. Elliott. And I
have
have
that
to defend themselves in fairness.
Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Deputy.